The voice of a prophet faded into silence, and then for 4 centuries heaven did not speak again. Not a dream, not a vision, not a whisper. His final words were not comfort but warning, a warning that still cuts across time, reaching into our lives today. Imagine it, the last echo of God's voice before 400 years of silence. The question is, have we listened? Because this was not just a message for Israel. This was the last message before the heavens went quiet. And it may hold the key to our time. The year was closing on a weary nation. Israel had returned from exile, a people brought back to their homeland, a temple rebuilt, a city rising once more. But while the walls of Jerusalem stood tall again, the walls of their faith had crumbled. Priests offered sacrifices, yet their hands were stained with corruption. Worship continued, but it had lost its fire. Families broke their vows. The covenant, the sacred promise that bound them to God, was treated like an old story, fading into dust. The people wanted blessing. They wanted prosperity. But their devotion was shallow, their obedience thin. They asked, "Where is the God of justice?" Yet they themselves lived without justice. They asked, "Where is his love?" Yet they gave him their leftovers, their blemished offerings, their half-hearted worship. They expected the hand of heaven, while giving only scraps in return. This is the world Malachi entered. Not a prophet of thunder like Elijah, not a prophet of visions like Daniel. Malachi's voice was steady, sharp, and unrelenting. He was the final prophet of the Old Testament, the last bridge between God's law and the arrival of God's Son. Every word he spoke carried the weight of centuries, and his warning was clear. If Israel did not return to God with their whole heart, a great and terrible day would come. A day of judgment. A day no man could escape. The nation had returned home, but their hearts had wandered far away. If you believe God's word still speaks across generations, subscribe now. If you don't, then explain why you'd walk away from his last warning in the comments. The temple doors were open, but the people's hearts were closed. The priests wore their robes, lit the lamps, and placed the sacrifices upon the altar. But they brought animals that were blind, crippled, and diseased. They offered to God what they would never dare offer to their governor. They treated the holy as common, the sacred as cheap. And Malachi's voice thundered, "You bring defiled food to my altar, and then ask, 'How have we defiled you?' Would you present these offerings to your rulers? Would they accept you?" The people bowed their heads in prayer, but their prayers were hollow. They lifted their hands in worship, but their hearts were elsewhere. They broke their covenants in marriage, betraying the very vows they made before God. Husbands abandoned their wives. Families fractured under faithlessness. And Malachi warned, "The Lord has been witness between you and the wife of your youth. Guard yourselves in spirit and do not be faithless." Even their tithes, the offerings that sustained the temple, the gifts that kept God's work alive, were stolen. They robbed God, keeping for themselves what belonged to him. And yet, they had the audacity to ask, "How have we robbed you?" Malachi's answer was cutting, in tithes and offerings. "You are under a curse, your whole nation, because you are robbing me." They expected blessing, but God warned of a curse. They expected protection, but God promised fire. They wanted prosperity, but he declared, "I will send a messenger before me, and the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple." But who can endure the day of his coming? Who can stand when he appears? For he is like a refiner's fire and like fuller's soap. The people thought they were safe because the temple stood in their midst. But Malachi stripped away their illusions. The temple would not save them. Their rituals would not protect them. Without true repentance, judgment was coming. And this was not just a prophecy to Israel. It is a warning that points directly to us. Imagine a courtroom. The judge sits in silence. The charges are read aloud. Israel is on trial. The evidence is overwhelming. They robbed, they betrayed, they defiled. And every excuse they gave was turned against them. Guilty, guilty, guilty. But listen carefully. The echo of that trial is not locked in the past. It echoes still. The accusations leveled against Israel mirror the state of our own generation. Empty worship, broken vows, corruption in leadership, robbery of what belongs to God. This is why Malachi's prophecy is alive today, because his words were not bound to his century. They are bound to the human heart. The temple doors were open, but the people's hearts were closed. The incense rose to heaven, but their prayers carried no fragrance. They wore garments of praise, but underneath was hypocrisy. They sang songs of devotion, but their lives sang a different tune. Would you still worship if God demanded your best and not your scraps? Would you offer what is holy, or would you hold back what belongs to Him? If you believe you would stand faithful in this trial, subscribe now. If you wouldn't, then write why. Write why you'd keep back your worship in the comments below. The accusations were clear. The trial had been set. But what lay beyond Malachi's rebuke was something even more terrifying. For silence was coming, silence that would last centuries. And when the silence ended, the voice that broke it would prepare the way for the Messiah himself. And then, the voice was gone. Malachi spoke and silence followed. Not for a week, not for a year, but for 4 centuries. 400 long years where heaven withheld its voice. No visions came, no dreams carried messages. No prophet walked the streets of Jerusalem to cry out against injustice. The heavens, it seemed, had shut their doors. Generations came and went. Fathers told their children about the God who parted seas and spoke from mountains. Mothers reminded their sons and daughters of Abraham, of Moses, of Elijah. But the children grew, and they never saw the fire. They never heard the thunder. They never witnessed the miracles. All they had were stories and the lingering words of Malachi. Generations prayed, but the heavens stayed quiet. Priests entered the temple, lit the lamps, burned the incense, and waited for the voice of God, but none came. The voice of Malachi became the echo they could not escape. His warnings played like a drumbeat in the background of their worship. His accusations lingered in the silence. You rob God. You break faith. You treat His altar with contempt, and the silence seemed to agree. 4 centuries. Empires rose and fell. Persia gave way to Greece. Greece crumbled before Rome. Kings, soldiers, tyrants, and Caesars reigned in power. Yet through it all, the heavens were silent. The people cried out, but God's reply was not in words. His reply was the silence itself. Can you imagine it? A lifetime lived without a single fresh word from God. A child is born, grows into adulthood, grows old and dies, and not once in their entire lifetime do they hear a prophet's voice. Not once do they see a miracle. Not once do they sense God speaking to their generation. Faith became a test of endurance. Worship became an act of trust, and many failed. Some clung to ritual, going through the motions, hoping one day the silence would break. Others gave up altogether, deciding that God was a tale from the past. And still others twisted the silence to their advantage, building religious systems that looked holy on the outside, but inside were corrupt. The silence revealed who truly believed and who only played the part. But silence is not absence. Silence is not abandonment. Silence is a test of patience, a test of faith, a test of obedience when no reward seems near. For in the silence, God was not gone. He was preparing the stage for the voice that would come after Malachi, preparing the world for a prophet who would not whisper in temples, but cry out in the wilderness. Generations prayed, but the heavens stayed quiet. The temple filled with smoke, but the throne of God gave no reply. The scrolls were read aloud, but no new words were written. The silence stretched across centuries, heavy and unrelenting, like a shadow that would not lift. Would you remain faithful if God was silent for your entire lifetime? Would you still pray, still worship, still believe, even if no answer came? If yes, prove it. Subscribe now. If not, then be honest. Write why you'd give up in the comments below. The struggle of Israel was not just about their sacrifices or their offerings. It was about enduring silence, about living in a drought of the soul, holding on when there was nothing to hold but memory. That silence pressed on generation after generation, until one day, when the time was right, the silence broke, and the voice that shattered it would change the world forever. Out of Malachi's mouth came a final promise, a final warning. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers, or else I will come and strike the land with total destruction. These were the last words written in the scroll, the last echo of God's voice before silence, a prophecy that pointed ahead like a shadow stretching into the future. What did this mean? The people understood the name Elijah, the prophet of fire, the one who called down flames from heaven on Mount Carmel. the one who stood against kings and false gods. Elijah was gone, yet Malachi declared he would return. But how? In what way? The answer would not come for 4 centuries. Not until a man appeared in the wilderness, clothed in camel's hair, eating locusts and wild honey. His voice thundered like no other, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand." That man was John the Baptist, the Elijah who was promised. Do you see it? The last voice of the Old Testament was pointing to the first voice of the New. Malachi's prophecy bridged the silence. It prepared the stage for the one who would prepare the way for Christ. John the Baptist was not Elijah reborn, but he carried Elijah's spirit, his boldness, his fire. He shattered the silence with a cry that shook the wilderness. Prepare the way of the Lord. Picture the scene. Israel had grown restless under the weight of silence. They had suffered under empire after empire, first the Persians, then the Greeks, and finally the Romans. Soldiers patrolled their streets, taxes drained their homes, corruption sat on thrones, and still God had not spoken. But then a voice rose in the desert, not in the temple, not in the palace, but in the wilderness. A prophet emerged where no one expected, fulfilling the very words Malachi had spoken. The silence was not absence. The silence was preparation. Rome thought it held the world in its iron grip. Caesar claimed the title of king, but prophecy was unfolding in the shadows. The Messiah was drawing near. The stage of history, with all its power, politics, and oppression, was only the backdrop for God's plan. Malachi's prophecy was more than a warning. It was a signpost. It was the torch handed to the next runner in the race of history. It told Israel to watch, to wait, to prepare, and for 400 years, they held their breath, waiting for the Elijah who would come. And when John's voice broke the silence, prophecy became reality. Proof, undeniable proof, that every word God speaks finds its fulfillment. The last voice of the Old Testament was pointing to the first voice of the New. The silence wasn't absence, it was preparation. Rome ruled with an iron hand, but prophecy ruled with an invisible hand. When the silence broke, it broke with fire. If you believe prophecy always finds its fulfillment, subscribe now. If you don't, then explain why you'd ignore 400 years of proof in the comments. The silence had ended, the prophecy was fulfilled, but the weight of Malachi's words did not vanish. They carried forward into every generation, including ours. For his warning was not only about priests, offerings, and sacrifices, it was about hearts, hearts that turn toward God, or hearts that turn away. And the legacy of that choice has never disappeared. Malachi's scroll was rolled shut. His words became the last entry in Israel's history before centuries of silence. Yet those words were not buried in the past. They became a mirror for every generation that would come after. For Malachi spoke not only to a nation of wandering priests and careless worshipers, he spoke to every heart that grows cold, to every people that forget their covenant, to every land that chooses corruption over justice, convenience over truth, and selfishness over sacrifice. Malachi's warning was not locked in the past. It was written for every generation that grows weary, every nation that forgets God. The accusations he leveled against Israel echo loudly in our time. Families broken, vows abandoned, worship reduced to empty ritual. Corruption hidden behind robes of leadership. A people giving God what costs them nothing, and yet demanding everything in return. The voice of Malachi pierces across the centuries to say, "I, the Lord, do not change. Return to me, and I will return to you." Look around our world today. What do we see? Families torn apart by betrayal, marriages discarded like worn-out garments, fathers absent, children wandering, generations divided. Malachi warned of hearts turning away from each other, and he promised that the day of the Lord would expose it all. Do you see? His prophecy was not merely ancient history, it was a glimpse of the present. What else did Malachi see? A people robbing God, withholding from him what was rightfully his. Today, the same spirit thrives. Greed replacing generosity, selfishness replacing stewardship, money raised higher than mercy. Malachi's voice still cries out, "Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse. Test me in this and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven." Even now, God's challenge remains. Even now, his promise stands. Blessing follows obedience. Judgment follows rebellion. And what of justice? Malachi accused Israel of mocking God, saying, "Where is the God of justice?" They complained that evil men prospered while the righteous suffered. Does that sound familiar? Corruption thrives. Leaders grow rich, the innocent are trampled, and voices rise even today. Where is God? Where is his justice? Malachi answers still, he is coming. And when he comes, he will be like a refiner's fire. This is the legacy of Malachi. His prophecy was never meant to fade into dust. It was meant to prepare every generation, to remind us that God's silence is not his absence, that his justice may be delayed, but it will not be denied, and that obedience is the measure of true worship. His words echo louder now than ever, because the world looks frighteningly like the Israel he rebuked. Malachi's warning was not locked in the past. It was written for every generation that grows weary, every nation that forgets God, families collapsing, corruption reigning, faith losing its grip. These were not just the sins of ancient Israel, they are the sins of our world today. And if Malachi's words carried enough weight to echo through 4 centuries of silence, how much more must they echo into our present? His call is still clear. Return. Return in faith. Return in obedience. Return in preparation for the King who is coming. Malachi spoke, and the heavens closed. John cried out, and the heavens opened again. And soon after, the Word himself became flesh and dwelt among us. But Malachi's challenge has not vanished. It is alive, staring us in the face. The real question is not whether Malachi's prophecy still speaks. The real question is, will we listen? Malachi's prophecy was the last word before silence. The scroll was sealed and heaven fell quiet. But silence does not mean God is gone. Silence does not mean he has turned his face away. Silence means he is preparing. Preparing hearts, preparing nations, preparing the stage for the greatest arrival in history. 400 years passed, but when the silence broke, it broke with the cry of a child in Bethlehem. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The question is not whether Malachi's prophecy still speaks. The question is, will we be ready? Ready when justice finally arrives. Ready when God calls us to account. Ready when the fire of his holiness tests the truth of our worship. Malachi spoke of a day that would burn like an oven, consuming arrogance like stubble, but also a day when the Son of Righteousness would rise with healing in its wings. Judgment and mercy, fire and healing, both are promised. Which one will you face? Malachi's words stand as the dividing line. They were the last warning before Christ came the first time, and they are still the warning before he comes again. You cannot stand in the middle. You cannot stay neutral. You either return or you turn away. You either prepare or you perish unprepared. And make no mistake, ignoring the warning is still a choice. Malachi's voice has not faded. It echoes now louder than ever. The silence was not absence, it was preparation. The last warning before the Messiah's first coming is the same warning before his return. If you believe Malachi's last prophecy still speaks today, subscribe right now. Do not hesitate. Do not wait, because every second you wait is a second closer to the day Malachi spoke of. And if you wouldn't subscribe if you think this warning is not for you, then write why. Write why.